Turkey's active diplomacy and international involvement meant Recep Tayyip Erdogan's re-election was monitored closely from Washington to Moscow. So how influential is Turkey internationally? And what can we expect in foreign policy during Erdogan's third term? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's return to power in Turkey means a crucial player in the geopolitical arenas of Europe and the Middle East remains in place for another 5 years. Analysts have described President Erdogan's foreign policy as representing both continuity and change. A flexible approach driven by pragmatism can at times place him in a unique position. Turkey has NATO's second largest military. It is also the only member of the defense alliance that enjoys meaningful relations with Russia. Erdogan helped broker a deal between Moscow and Kyiv to allow the shipment of grain from occupied Ukrainian ports, averting a global food crisis. We'll be discussing how Turkey sees the world and how the world sees Turkey with our guests in a few moments. But first, this report from Siobhan Silk.
Turkey's proactive foreign policy has been a hallmark of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's time in office. But relations with the West have been rocky since an attempted coup in 2016. Erdogan believes his Western partners failed to support him, prompting him to take a more independent path, despite established alliances such as the country's membership of NATO.
Gelecek 5 sene boyunca
For the next 5 years, we promise to work with all our strength to protect the glory and honor of Turkey, to increase its reputation around the world. We guarantee the protection of our state, the integrity of our homeland, and the unconditional sovereignty of our nation.
NATO allies are hoping Ankara will give the green light to Sweden's bid to join the defence alliance before a summit in July. Erdogan has delayed approving the application for months now, straining relations with the US and NATO allies. There's tension too with the US over Turkey's cordial relations with Russia. But Erdogan has also supplied Kyiv with weapons despite objections from Moscow. The president sees keeping channels open with Putin as vital if he's to mediate in the war in Ukraine. Closer to home, Erdogan has promised to continue military involvement in Syria.
muhataplarımız karşılarında
Observers will find a more determined, braver, more active and more compassionate Turkey, which fights against terrorist organizations more decisively, both inside and outside its borders.
A relentlessly pragmatic approach to foreign policy has sometimes meant shifting alliances. Last year, Turkey reset relations with many of its regional foes, including Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt and Armenia. And as some Arab nations reconcile with Syria, it's likely Ankara too will speed up the normalisation of relations with its southern neighbour. Siobhan Silk for Inside Story.
All right, for more on all this, let's bring in our guests. In Moscow is Dmitry Babich, political analyst at Rossiya, Segodnya, an international media group based in the Russian capital. In Istanbul is Seda Demiralp, associate professor at Isik University. She specializes in the political economy of Islam. And in Brussels is Stephen Erlanger, chief diplomatic correspondent in Europe for the New York Times. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Story. Seda, let me start with you today. Now that President Erdogan has been re-elected, should we expect continuity as well as change when it comes to Turkey's foreign policy?
Well, yes, I do expect continuity in large extent. After all, it's the same leader, it's the same party. And Erdogan has been branding himself and Turkey as an actor who can talk to both the West and the East, a NATO member on the one hand, but can talk to Putin on the other hand. His role as a mediator during the Russia-Ukraine war, and particularly the foundation of the grain corridor agreement, for instance, it was a major international accomplishment for Erdogan, and he presented it as such in domestic politics, and he was rewarded by his voters. like selling drones to Ukraine, buying natural gas from Russia, and making both sides accept that. It was a thin line to walk, and Erdogan emphasized that he had those skills. So I do expect Erdogan to continue presenting himself as an independent world leader, promoting Turkish interests, not anyone else's, and highlight Turkey's role as a country that has a strong defense industry, an independent international position vis-a-vis major world powers, basically a rational actor, rational outlook, maximizing Turkish interests rather than an ideology or any world powers.
Say the fact that Mevlut Çavuşoğlu, he had served as foreign minister since 2014. President Erdogan just named Hakan Fidan, his intelligence chief, as the new foreign minister. What does that mean in all this?
Well, Hakan Fidan is, like you say, former chief intelligence. He's known to be a rational actor, pro-Western, you could say, but also proactive, not a passive partner of the West. Peaceful relations with the West while promoting Turkey's interest proactively. He has been big about promoting security along the Syrian border, so we may expect his appointment as Erdogan's commitment to his rather new policy in Syria, which promotes security along the Syrian border and allow some of the Syrian refugees to go back rather than criticizing Assad's domestic policy or promoting political change in Syria. So peace or dialogue with Syria, establish border security along the Syrian border and fight terrorism. That's what Hakan Fidan has been representing.
Stephen, obviously we can't have this conversation without addressing NATO early on in the discussion. Just a short while ago, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg called on Turkey to drop its opposition to Sweden's accession to NATO. I want to ask you about that because Turkey approved Finland's accession to NATO in March. But where do things stand right now when it comes to granting approval to Sweden to join?
Well, a lot of it is in Mr. Erdogan's head. The hope is in Washington, in Brussels, elsewhere, certainly in Stockholm, that having been reelected by a good margin, having shown his nationalist credentials, having, I think with justice, able to say that Sweden's new anti-terrorism law, which went into effect June 1st, is in large part due to his pressure on Sweden to crack down on Kurdish terrorism and others forms, that Mr. Erdogan will decide it's enough and will allow Sweden in. I mean, that's my view. I may be wrong. Again, I'm not inside his head, but I do think given his economic troubles, which are severe, he needs to calm some things down elsewhere. And I suspect mending ties a bit with NATO will help, whether it happens before the Vilnius summit, which is like July 10th or so, or if it comes afterwards, I'm not sure. I mean, Erdogan may want to negotiate right up to the last minute, even inside Vilnius itself, but I think Turkey does want these F-16s from the United States and updated kits, and the American Congress has made it pretty clear that Swedish approval of Sweden to NATO is kind of a quid pro quo for that.
Stephen, more longer term, I want to get your viewpoint on what President Erdogan's re-election means for NATO and also for Western geopolitical goals, because there are analysts out there that believe that Erdogan is a bit of a threat to cohesion amongst the NATO members.
I don't think it's a problem inside NATO, especially, to be honest, because NATO is a military alliance. It doesn't really concern itself much with issues of rule of law and press freedom and those things for which Erdogan is quite rightly criticized. Turkey plays a crucial role, as Ms. Demiralp said very, very accurately, controlling the Black Sea, being a balancer between Russia and even Ukraine. And I wouldn't be surprised if we finally get to some kind of peace talks there, that Mr. Erdogan will be one of the mediators. He, after all, did host early peace talks between Russia and Ukraine that didn't go very well. Now, with Greece, I mean, he made a lot of noise during the campaign about Greece, but in fact, I think, again, given his economic issues, I think he's not looking for more trouble inside NATO. That's, again, I may be wrong, but that's my sense of what's going to happen.
Dmitry, the relationship between Turkey and Russia is a complicated one. We know that. Turkey has been performing this balancing act when it comes to Russia and Ukraine. Turkey provides weapons to Ukraine, but it also has been deepening its economic cooperation with Russia. How does President Vladimir Putin view the re-election of President Erdogan?
Well, the reaction in the Russian media and among the expert community was pretty positive. Russia was very cautious not to give any pretext to suspect it of involvement in elections. You know, these accusations were flying from the opposition, but I think it's absolutely nonsensical. You know, the Turks are voting for Erdogan because they want to. There is no way Russia can force them to vote for him. And you are right, the relationship has been a rocky one. Let me remind you that in 2015, the Turkish air forces have shot down a Russian plane near the Syrian border. But right now, Erdogan looks like the most rational person in the NATO. Ironically, you know, NATO and the West at large are supposed to be supporters of compromise, you know, supporters of pluralism and democracy. But unfortunately, it is Mr. Erdogan who shows flexibility, who shows ability to compromise. Look, with Syria, Erdogan is ready for peace. There are rumors that he may meet Mr. Assad and have some sort of compromise with him after all of these years of war. We can't say it about the West. The West keeps saying Assad must go, and the West is, preventing Syria from having normal economic ties with other countries of the world when it needs it badly, you know, after the civil war. So Russia supports this ability of Mr. Erdogan to compromise. As for his team, I would say that this is very much like Russia. In fact, Mr. Erdogan has inside his team some liberal pro-Western politicians. I mean, look at the biography of Yashar Güler, you know, the new Minister of Defense. He worked in the NATO contingent in Bosnia. You know, he was with the NATO command in Italy. The same can be said about Hakan Fidan. Yes, he is a former intelligence chief, but before that, he was an advisor to the Australian embassy in Turkey, and he worked with several British institutions. So I think the Western media, when it portrays Putin and Erdogan as isolationists, you know, who are just irrational, unpredictable, and who don't want to have anything in common with the West, this is simply not true. These people, I mean, Putin until recently, Erdogan even now, they were open to contacts with the West. It was the West that was rigid and rejecting any compromise and basically leading the things to the terrible state where we see them now in the Middle East and in between Russia and Ukraine.
Dmitry, let me ask you this. Do you expect that Turkey will continue to play a leading diplomatic role between Russia and Ukraine? Can we expect more shuttle diplomacy from President Erdogan going forward?
I hope so, because Mr. Erdogan looks like the likeliest candidate for this kind of role. You rightly said that there are weapons being supplied from Turkey to Ukraine, but these are private companies doing that. Bayraktar is a private company. Of course, we are very sad about the fact that the Turkish government did not prevent these private companies from doing that. But this is, of course, a far cry from what, for example, Greece or Slovakia are doing. You know, the governments provide weapons to the Ukrainian army. So I think Mr. Erdogan looks like a very likely candidate for some kind of a mediating role. And let me remind you that last year, in March, in Istanbul, Russia and Ukraine were very close to some kind of a deal. It was Boris Johnson who came to Kiev and who persuaded Zelensky to fight until the victory of Ukraine. It was him who basically seemed to be, destroying that deal. Not only Boris Johnson, of course. In general, the new NATO line that Ukrainian victory is possible and we must push for it, that was very destructive. But that was not Mr. Erdogan's position. He did everything to facilitate a deal between Russia and Ukraine.
Seda, I want to talk more specifically right now about Turkey's relationship with the U.S., which has been fraught. It's been tense for a while. U.S. President Joe Biden said just a few days ago that he had spoken with President Erdogan in a call and that President Erdogan had repeated Ankara's desire to buy F-16 fighter jets from the U.S. Mr. Biden reportedly told Mr. Erdogan that Washington wants Ankara to drop its objection to Sweden joining NATO. So I want to ask you, is this what all this is going to hinge upon going forward?
Well, yes and no. I mean, Turkey's relations with the United States went through a downturn after the Arab Spring, particularly regarding Syrian politics. Erdogan particularly felt let down by the USA in his policies in Syria. And ever since, we've seen some alienation between Turkey and the US. But then still, Erdogan has never been actively promoting an anti-Western agenda. And now with Hakan Fidan's appointment as Minister of Foreign Affairs, I think we will see more rapprochement between the Western Turkey, particularly the USA and Turkey. Hakan Fidan has been known for his pro-Western policies, like I mentioned before, quite a rational actor. So that's what I expect to see between USA and Turkey. Closer relationships, but still Erdogan will try to defend an independent position.
Stephen, I saw you reacting there to what Seda was saying. I'm going to let you jump in, but I also want to ask you first about this very tricky balancing act that President Erdogan is going to have to try and navigate when it comes to Turkey's relationship with Syria going forward, specifically because Syria has now been reinstated as a member to the Arab League. So is that going to mean added pressure on Mr. Erdogan to normalize relations with Syria?
Well, I think it will. Don't forget, even in the campaign, one of the opposition charges against Erdogan was that there are too many refugees. Now, from Islamic solidarity, Mr. Erdogan welcomed more than 4 million Syrian refugees. And I think he would like to do a deal with Mr. Assad to send a big chunk of them back. It's become unpopular inside Turkey. Don't forget, Turkey actually occupies a chunk of northern Syria. So I think Erdogan may want to try to do a deal with Assad about the border. I mean, clearly what Mr. Erdogan is concentrating on is the Kurdish Workers' Party and its Syrian affiliates. That's what worries him. That's what drives him. So I think he'll be pushed to deal with Mr. Assad, but who we wanted to overthrow, don't forget, before. But I think in the end, it's probably good for Mr. Erdogan because the things he wants out of Syria, Mr. Assad might be able to get him.
Dmitry, how beneficial to Russia is its financial relationship with Turkey? And also, does President Putin expect President Erdogan to turn away from the West more going forward?
Well, I mean, we don't want other countries to turn away from anyone, including the West. We want to cooperate with everyone. Unfortunately, the relations with the West were driven into a dead end, believe me, not by Russia, but by the other side. And I think that the example of Mr. Erdogan is a very good one. I mean, the West may accuse him of not being consequential, not trying to, oust Mr. Assad until the second coming. But this is a big question. What is more moral, to be consequential and to continue to pressure a country that went through a civil war by economic sanctions and by all sorts of pressure, or to make peace and to excuse yourself for certain mistakes that you made? I mean, Erdogan excused himself before Russia for shooting down that plane in 2015, and we accepted we accepted his apology. So I think what Putin expects from Erdogan is pragmatism. Turkey is a sovereign country. It needs Russian gas. It needs economic cooperation with Russia and other countries of the former Soviet Union. And Turkey is one of the few countries that can sustain Western pressure. The West is now absolutely, forcing other countries to stop economic cooperation with Russia, to imposing the so-called secondary sanctions on them. Turkey is one of the few countries that can resist this pressure, and I think Putin hopes that Erdogan would be able to resist it. But there are no illusions in Russia. We understand that Turkey and its president are, first of all, after their own interests. That's normal. We are not the West. We are not going to say those who are not with us are against us. Those who are not against us, they're all our partners, including Erdogan, including Turkey.
Stephen, it looked like you wanted to jump in. Go ahead.
Well, just simply to say that Russia's isolation and NATO's support for Ukraine is a function of Russia's invasion of a sovereign country. Let's not forget that. And to try to pretend that Erdogan and Mr. Putin's positions are the same is frankly a little disingenuous, put it like that. Mr. Erdogan is very good at defining what he thinks is the Turkish national interest, which is fine, and he's done it pretty well, but that includes being part of a NATO alliance. And if he is dependent on Russia, which he is for gas, for hard currency, for economic ties, and don't forget, Turkey has not joined Western sanctions against Russia. This is part of being an ally with a lot of interests, but to pretend that somehow Erdogan is being isolated the way Mr. Putin is being isolated, again, I would just say is disingenuous.
Dmitry, I see you raising your hand. I know you want to make a point. I will let you, but please keep in mind we are running out of time, and I do want to get a question into Seda as well.
Okay, very short. Okay, very short. I think Steve and me, we know each other since 1991 when we briefly met in Moscow, so he knows the long story before Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. But also Stephen himself has just said that Turkey occupies a chunk of Syrian territory. Syria is a sovereign country. And let me remind you, the United States occupies some very important chunk of Syrian territory with a lot of oil there. Remember how Mr. Trump said, I got the oil. So I think the United States is the last country that can accuse Russia of breaking international law.
Seda, let me ask you about the economy, because President Erdogan named Mehmet Şimşek as the Treasury and Finance Minister in his new cabinet. Şimşek had been highly regarded by investors when he served previously as the economy chief. I want to ask you about if this appointment in particular marks a departure from these years of unorthodox economic policies under Mr. Erdogan, and also, will this be a move that is welcomed by international investors?
Well, Şimşek is known. I mean, he proved himself previously in Turkish politics. He has been quite successful, but he represents, as you mentioned, orthodox economic policies, while Erdogan has been quite insisting on these low interest, unorthodox policies. Erdogan has been claiming that he could fight inflation with low interests, going against all established economic principles. So many people wonder whether Şimşek coming back means Erdogan is actually finally willing to return to orthodox economic policies, or will he pressure Şimşek to do his magic, but remain committed to unorthodox policies? Well, on his victory speech, Erdogan just recently emphasized that he has no plan of deviating from his unorthodox policies, but then again, appointing Şimşek will make some people question, well, maybe if there will be some deviations, and depending on, well, the extent of these deviations, we may expect outcomes. If there will be some minor raise in interests, many people doubt that that will bring major consequences, because if we want to return to orthodox economic policies, we need a major increase in interest rates. But just some people say, even if there will be modest increase in interest rates, that coupled with Şimşek's high reputation can maybe attract foreign investment and can create a positive vibe that can stimulate economic normalization again.
And Seda, just very quickly, we have 1 minute left. Where does Erdogan's relationship with Arab countries, and more specifically with the wider Middle East, go from here?
Well, during the Arab Spring, we saw Turkish foreign policy drifting away from its traditional pro-Western path towards a more neo-Ottomanist direction, trying to influence Middle East politics, assuming leadership of the Muslim Middle East. But over time, Erdogan was humbled down. One, because of problem of Syrian refugees. Second, feeling betrayed by the USA. And third, economic difficulties. All of these pushed Erdogan towards a more humble, rational line. We see Erdogan trying to start dialogue again with Syria, Egypt, and Libya, or Saudi Arabia and Arab Emirates on the other hand. So particularly regarding Gulf countries, oil-rich countries, I guess you could say conflicts are less important now than Erdogan's need of short-term funding.
All right. Well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thank you so much to all of our guests, Dmitry, Babich, Seda, Demiralp, and Stephen Erlanger. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.